Do not attempt to adjust your radio, or your phone app, or your phone. You are listening to the Doctor Who Collectors Podcast. We present a special joint podcast episode between the Doctor Who Target Book Club Podcast and the Doctor Who Collectors Podcast. So the first part will be the Doctor Who Target Book Club Podcast as we all discuss The Doctor in the Enterprise by Jean Airy, a fan fiction novel from the late 70s, early 80s. Enjoy your travels.
Hello, fellow time travelers, and welcome back to the Doctor Who Target Book Club, the podcast in which we undertake the collaborative task of discussing in story order all the Doctor Who novelizations. My name is Tony Whitt, and today we have an equally collaborative four-person discussion panel, including our so-called expert who's been a Who fan since 1979. That would be me. There's our intermediate-level casual fan who's seen several episodes but has not previously read any of the books until these podcasts, and this time it's the worthy Dalton Hughes. Hello, Dalton.
Hello.
There's also our semi-novice fan, one who has seen little to none of the original series and has not previously read any of the books except for the ones we've done for this podcast, and this time around it's the wise and witty Alyson Fitch-Safreed. Hello, Alyson.
Hello to all.
And finally, we have a special guest with whom we are doing this, our 100th episode, as a joint podcast with the Doctor Who Collectors Podcast, the host of which is with us today, the incomparable Larry VanMersbergen. Hello, Larry.
Hello, Tony. Happy to be here to celebrate this amazing achievement, 100 episodes.
We did it.
Yeah, and we only have, 60, 70 more to go?
Well, they're still publishing Target books, so you might have more.
So we need to slow down the rate of production so that we will never run out.
No, we don't. We really don't. Now that we can see the train at the end of the tunnel.
Tony, we're like sharks. If we don't keep moving, we'll die.
Well, yeah, but I'll probably die before any of y'all, so I need to get this done.
You're younger than me, Tony. You'll be fine.
Well, let's hope so. If you like what you're hearing, though at the moment I can't imagine that, please check our Patreon page at patreon.com/GWTargetBC. Depending on the amount you give per month, you will receive, among other possible goodies, face masks, mugs, and t-shirts with our logos on them, just like giving to PBS, but not a Target book. Since we know you have so many of them, you have opened a portal to a parallel universe to store them all in. They're there on the Enterprise with Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock, just to say thank you for being willing to help us stay on the virtual air. And as usual, we'd like to thank our regular patrons, Bart Lammy, Rick Taylor, Toby Bengelsdorf, Jay Barry of the Video Junkyard Podcast, the Doctor Who Collectors Podcast, Hans Wax, Stephen Pickering, James Sumnall, Dave Davis, Guy Lambert, and Simon Painter. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, gosh, that's harder to say in a deep breath than it's ever been before. We also have our Goodreads discussion group where you, the listener, can discuss upcoming books and previous podcasts. You can find us there at tinyurl.com/Y7KMASPR. In fact, we expect you to. We now take a break from our regularly scheduled discussion of Target and technically Target novels to look at a particularly influential fan work, one which fits, more or less, between the Tom Baker season we're currently discussing and the next one, even though I think it's actually further along than that. That work is the late Jean Airy's fan novel, The Doctor and the Enterprise. Without further ado, here are some fast facts.
The Doctor and the Enterprise, written by Jane Airy and originally published as a fanzine in 1982, republished by Pioneer Books in 1989. As of this recording in July of 2021, this title is currently out of print, 64 pages.
And by the way, I'm probably wrong about the page count, but there you go. Jean Airy is a fascinating fan figure. She was born in Albany, New York in 1943. Her day job was as an engineer for Bell Laboratories at Lucent Technologies, where she was named a distinguished member of technical staff. Now, that's impressive in and of itself, but she was also an avid writer in various genres, including fiction, playwriting, and science fiction journalism. Her published articles appeared in John Peel's Fantasy Empire magazine and in Starlog magazine, among others. She also wrote, directed, and appeared in plays both in Aurora, Illinois, where she lived with her husband and where Larry VanMersbergen currently lives, and in Inglewood, Florida, where she moved in her later years to care for her ailing father. She served in various historical societies, one of which was based in Inglewood, and eventually wrote and published Inglewood Fireside Tales Volume 1 in 2011, which is still available on Amazon. She did co-write and publish one nonfiction Target book, though, with Laurie Haldeman, and that was Travels Without the TARDIS in 1986, which allegedly, and I say allegedly, covered several of the real-world locations used for the show. I say allegedly for reasons which Larry will get to when we get to his half of the podcast. She died in Inglewood in 2016 at the age of 73. The publication history of the Doctor and the Enterprise is fraught, shall we say, which, again, Larry will cover in his section of our joint podcast. There is no back cover. At least we don't have a back cover, so we don't have a dramatic reading of the back cover this time, which is just as well. It basically would just say the Doctor ends up on Starship Enterprise. I should probably tell everybody listening what the actual plot is, because unless you went and downloaded a copy of this from our link in the last episode, you won't know. Somehow the TARDIS... No, it's the other way around. Somehow the Enterprise ends up in the Doctor Who universe. For reasons. Don't ask me to go into them. But the TARDIS ends up materializing on the transporter pad. The Doctor has been injured in some previous altercation. It's not really said what. He falls unconscious. Spock ends up accidentally mind-melding with him because he trips and falls and touches him for some reason. And they develop a bond, obviously. And the entire story, which is essentially in 4 parts, is the Doctor trying to help the crew of the Enterprise get back to their own universe while having to deal with Kirk's jealousy, I'm going to call it that, and the fact that there are Sontarans around and there are Daleks around, because of course there are. All right, let's jump straight into this, shall we? Let's talk about the positives of this first, because there are some negatives, just a few. First of all, let's talk about Dalton and Alyson's first impressions, and then we can talk about Larry and my first impressions, since ours go straight back to the 80s. So, Dalton, your first impression when you knew that we were doing this, what was your first impression?
Well, I talked with you a little bit about me not being super familiar with the classic Star Trek. I know the characters, but I haven't really seen very much of it. So I was kind of interested to see where they were going to go with it. And just from kind of reading it, I feel like this feels more like a Star Trek story than a Doctor Who story.
Yeah, it does. It very much does.
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it really comes as a bit of a shock, I guess, after reading all the novelizations we've been reading from Target that are very Doctor Who, especially after reading so many Terrence Dicks books back to back to back. This is kind of a whiplash. but I felt like it was really enjoyable. I enjoyed the Doctor's relationship with Spock, their little romance, I guess. It felt like, yeah.
It is a bit slashy, isn't it?
I was going to say, yeah, there's definitely probably more slash somewhere, the two of them together. But I really felt like I got a feeling for Spock and Kirk. The Doctor's felt a little less like himself, but yeah, I still really enjoyed it, though, for what it's worth.
Okay. Alyson, what was your first impression when you knew we were going to do this?
Well, in the first 5 pages, I lost an inordinate amount of time to a timeline crisis that I think the writer and the characters would all have sympathized with. So, like, all right, how do I visualize the lighting design? Because I've actually started rewatching a bit of original series because, much to my husband's dismay, on what's available now streaming, the special effects are redone in some like early 2000s that's arguably worse than the original models. But the remastering of the color is exquisite, and I had forgotten how good the lighting design was, especially the use of color.
Oh, yeah.
Especially compared to the era of Tom Baker that we've been reading, which I think not as much of, just clips of, etc. So I was kind of, I kept, having this sort of pseudo-schizophrenic crisis about how to visualize what's going on. I'm thinking, all right, 66 to 69, but actually that would have been the Hartnell doctor, right? Not Troughton. I had to Google that. I was talking with the Troughton doctor, not Hartnell, certainly not Baker. And actually they're in 1980, we're told, or the doctor meant to go to 1980, but it's in 2204. So it took me a while to calm down with all that. But I actually loved that you sent, Tony, both versions. So you sent a PDF of I guess we would call it not the original, but the original commercial bootleg.
I believe so. That's
and
the one
I
Larry sent us,
scrolled
yes.
through the illustrations. I was saying, oh, this is going to be some unpleasant medicine to take. And then you said, here's a text-only link. Also, if you'd like to look at that. And that started with Jean Airy's write-up of the history of the publication, and it was a 1991 write-up that basically expressed some dismay and disgust that it had been published as, I think she calls it, a very expensive book, and said you're free to reproduce it, but basically you can't make money off of it. Please include this disclaimer. And not everyone's on computer networks, and I thought it was dated 1991, and I thought that was also rather historically delightful. I started getting broken links on that one after the third section, so I actually started with the text only. So it was an interesting experience for the second half or the final third to go back to the PDF with the illustrations because I had purged them from my mind before that. I have not talked about any story content whatsoever, but remember, I'm a History MA program dropout, so it was incredibly stimulating in both good and bad ways as I tried to situate the story within their respective universes in time, and then also the publication history of it as well. So I was invigorated even before I got to much content.
Oh, just wait.
Yeah, we will. Just wait. We will have to talk about where this sits in continuity because I have a guess, but I'm not entirely sure, and I think Larry will probably know better than I do on this one. Larry, when did you first see this? When did you first hear about it?
It's interesting. I first heard about this in 1982 when I visited my local comic book store, which was where my local Doctor Who supplies were being done. And the owner of the store had stopped me and said, hey, you got to read this. And he had, basically, it was in a 3-ring binder, typewritten pages, which is how she distributed it back then, of the Doctor and the Enterprise. And he said, well, you can borrow this and read it. And I said, cool. He said, yeah, you're going to love this because Scotty's trying to make the sonic screwdriver work and this is all happening and Spock mind melds. I'm like, oh, this is really cool. Because in 1982, the Star Trek phenomenon was kind of resurging in our world, and so the meeting of the two. So when I first read it, I was not yet in high school when I read this, and I thought it was fantastic. Rereading it now, it's like, okay, now I'm a little more educated and reading it again and going, oh, now and of course understanding, and I'll go into more of this later, of course, but I had listened to Jean Airy talk in 1985, and understanding more about the story and the follow-up story kind of, okay, now is a much later in life reading this, I understand where she's going with it and what was in her mind when she wrote it. But it's an enjoyable story. I think it's a great mix of the two worlds.
Okay. And the first time I saw it would have been in high school, and it would have been, in fact, I know exactly when it was 1987, because I had a friend who had a copy of it, and she loaned it to me. In fact, it was the copy that you sent us the PDF of, Larry. And I took one look at the artwork and was like, no, I'm out. And she said, give it a chance. I was like, okay, I'll try. And I got about maybe a third or fourth of the way through, and I was like, because I have to admit something. I have never been a fan of fan writing, even though I've done some myself.
Do you decline to proofread your own work?
I do, which has led to many an upset in my life. But yes, it's just, there is a term in fandom called fan wank, and it specifically refers to, let's throw this, and this in here because we've got these two universes colliding, and oh gosh, gee. And that was the way it hit me back in the 80s. Reading it this time, I noticed it wasn't hitting that button nearly as much because, again, I think I did the same thing that Larry did. I could kind of see what she was trying to do. But there were a couple of other bits that did hit that button, so my reaction to it's a bit mixed. I'm a little more open-minded to it now than I was then. So, yeah.
I felt like the voices for Kirk and Bones and Spock were immediately pitch perfect.
Yes.
The dialogue was just, could have been lifted from any episode just about of the show.
Yes. She gets the Star Trek characters absolutely right.
But not just regurgitation, like it was that style of wit and funny and quickness, but it was, original material. So that was actually substantially better than I was expecting.
Yeah. And that is something I think is an unalloyed positive about this book, especially the characterization of Kirk. Because if you read any of the pocket books from that era of Star Trek fiction, Gene Airy has essentially captured what Kirk is like in those books. Whenever he meets a character that he thinks is a threat to the ship, but possibly an ally, he reacts this way. He always feels threatened. And that's perfect. That's, if you were to read something by Diane Duane from her Romulan trilogy, you get exactly the same characterization. You get exactly the same characterizations of Spock and McCoy. It's really quite well done there.
Well, and the things about the plot that I didn't like that were out of character were also the sort of out of character things you would see in the first season of Star Trek when they were still establishing the characters. Like I was thinking, Spock would never just, accidentally trip and fall and mind meld. But actually in the first season, that's exactly the sort of thing that would happen when they were still establishing how things worked.
Yeah, and to be fair to her in that, she does kind of use that in order to get us into the whole link between them, and yet she knows what the implications of mind melds are because she gives Spock that line about, he reacts almost in offended. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that Kirk would ask what he's learned from that mind meld because it would be like opening someone else's mail and then having a third person ask you about it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so she's thought long and hard about all of these things, and I'd be very interested to know what other fan fiction she'd done before this, because I have a feeling it was mostly Star Trek stuff and not Doctor Who stuff. What are some of the other positives you saw in this?
I expected a lot more fan wankery, as you would say. As you know, I value a sense of disorientation when it's on purpose, so at first, we think the Doctor is in the usual universe in which the Enterprise finds itself, and we find out about a quarter of the way in, I think. Maybe it's a little earlier than that it's actually the other way around, that the Enterprise has stumbled into the Doctor's universe. I really enjoyed a lot of the dialogue in the first third, and I thought the brain had no nerved endings. Yours doesn't. And just a lot of sort of quick quips like that. That were entertaining. In terms of the jealousy you say was set up between Kirk and the Doctor, I think the obvious fan wankery would be first they fight and then they soon respect and admire one another, and it's like 5% fight, 95% mutual backslapping. Maybe the hand drops a little low on the backslap. But instead we have a much more substantial conflict where Kirk is naturally in control of every situation he's in, partly because of his magnetic charisma, and he meets someone else like that, and he feels like he has essentially lost control of the Enterprise because the Doctor is just as magnetic and charismatic, even though in a different persona, and he is always ahead of him in figuring out the situation because he's used to doing this sort of thing. So I thought that was a nice setup, but it would have been easy to do the one. I like that they had that setup of duality between Kirk and the Doctor, and then a different one going on with Spock and the Doctor. And I think either one of those would have been fine, but having both of them was actually something special about the book.
So you'd say that those were definitely handled well.
Yes, and it I think leaves you finding it interesting and thinking that there's more there to explore. And it's very easy to do those kinds of parallels to death very quickly. And I thought we felt like there was a lot of depth there with Spock and the Doctor, sort of interesting psychic abilities that are kind of sort of the things that are similar about them, the things that are different, but they also don't just, 5% fight and 95% backslap. There's a sort of a different dynamic and back and forth. So I thought that was the real strength and heart of the whole thing.
Yeah, I thought so too. In fact, it reminds me quite a bit of the Next Generation two-parter reunification, where Leonard Nimoy did a guest appearance as Spock, and he finally has a very short scene with Data, and you think, oh, there could have been more. It's like, no, that's more than enough. That's plenty.
But I actually still remember exactly that scene because overall I thought that story was kind of a letdown because it's almost impossible for it not to be.
Yeah.
But that I still remember that scene of, by abandoning, by turning your back on your humanity, you have turned your back on the thing that I most want, is still something I remember all these years later.
Picard has been a role model in my quest to be more human.
More human?
Yes, Ambassador.
Fascinating. You have an efficient intellect, superior physical skills, no emotional impediments. There are Vulcans who aspire all their lives to achieve what you've been given by design.
You are half human.
Yes.
Yet you have chosen a Vulcan way of life. In effect, you have abandoned what I have sought all my life.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, which is, it's kind of amazing that a message like that comes through in what is essentially a 2-hour commercial for Star Trek 6.
I'm sorry,
It's essentially that.
The episode or the novel?
The episode
I was confused.
The episode is.
Wow, she anticipated Star Trek 6.
No, no. Larry, you see what I have to deal with every week?
I know.
Jeez.
Perhaps we are but children. That comes up a lot in the book. Yeah.
Oh, God.
Oh, boy.
Anyway, what else? What else did we like?
I'll just want to say that I thought it was amazing that Jane thought of putting a sociologist on board to specialize in cultures, which was needed later.
Oh, yeah, Dorsey Stevens.
Almost like a video game thing. Well, you got to get Lieutenant Dorsey Stevens if you want to go to Light Under.
And it was amazing that she doesn't hook up with Kirk. That was actually also great restraint.
Oh, I know, right?
Well, Dorsey Stevens is a unique character, which I'll talk about her a lot more later because she becomes very important in the follow-up story. And she was introduced, basically she is Gene Aries' creation, and that's important to know.
I was wondering if she was possibly a Mary Sue. Now, I didn't see an actual Mary Sue character in this, but you know what fan writing is like.
Yes.
The writer is always going to put him or herself in it somewhere. Even if they're writing for Bantam Books or they're doing one of the pocket books, they will put in a Mary Sue character. But that character is actually written with quite a bit of restraint. She's there for a reason, and that purpose is served really well.
Well, and I think serving as the author's point of view rather than the author's fantasy insert, they're two different things.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
Right.
Agreed. Especially since the whole story is from Kirk's point of view, except when it switches.
Yes.
It switches at a very odd moment, which is one of the negatives for me, because the writing teacher in me looks at that switch and says, no, you don't do that. But we're still talking about the positives.
Right.
I actually don't immediately know what switch you're talking about.
When you get to, I believe it's part 4, when you get to part 4, it suddenly switches to McCoy's point of view for a little while. And it kind of has to, because at that point, I'm trying to remember exactly what's happening
Kirk's kind
in
of
the
in and
story.
out of consciousness.
That's it. That's it.
Right.
Kirk cannot tell the story anymore because he's basically laid low. What a pun. Laid low with this virus that is uncontrolled psychic abilities, which is transmitted sexually, kind of
sort of.
not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like admin privileges in certain online discussion groups. Sexually transmitted.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it has to switch to McCoy's point of view there, obviously. But it's just...
Well, in terms of the fan non-wankery or restraint, the obvious connection to set up between Spock and the Doctor would be them chummily discussing what, that they love humans despite the fact that humans are garbage or something like that. Talking about the non-human experience among the humans. And I like that the first point of connection was instead Spock's linguistic analysis of him calling himself the Doctor and the Doctor liking his analysis. So that's the kind of choice in the story that is made several times that works very well. To not go with the really obvious point of connection, but something a little more thoughtful and character-based. Not necessarily the top note of the character, but some secondary characteristic.
Yeah, and it does do that particularly well. I mean, obviously there is the obligatory Doctor Who joke in there, but it's been so long since we've had one of those in a piece of prose that I'm fine.
And if they're even in, Target books, then I can forgive it being in a fan fiction, so...
Yeah, if they can get away with it in so-called canonical fiction, then we can excuse it when a fan does it, even though every fan does it. What I can't excuse is capitalizing the in the Doctor, because his name is the Doctor, not the Doctor. Right. And every time I read that, I was like, oh my God, oh God.
Maybe she also doesn't read fan fiction, so she also does not proofread her own. She can't stand to read it like you.
Well, it's possible. What else?
I fear that I am getting ahead of myself in terms of the revelations in store for Dalton and I from the scholars here. So Kirk says he's lost 90-something crewmen, and for all his command experience, that he'll never accept that those deaths were necessary. Is that from the introduction to the Star Trek The Motion Picture novelization?
Hey everyone, it's Tony from the future, breaking in just for a moment to say that Alyson is absolutely right here, as it turns out. I didn't know this at the time of the recording, but after the recording, I went and looked in my copy of the novelization of Star Trek The Motion Picture, and sure enough, in the preface, Kirk indeed admits that he lost 94 of his crew during that first 5-year mission. So, kudos, Alyson. Sorry we didn't know it at the time.
I mean, a reference to that, did that come up before? Because I remember something that Roddenberry wrote in the introduction. It's from Kirk's perspective, something about all the people who died under his command, and it's a much darker take than we see in the original series. Although the original series is darker than we sometimes remember.
Right.
And I didn't know in terms of publication which came first. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Roddenberry's novelization would have come first.
Yes.
I have a copy of it, but it's in the other room, and I can't go and get it. But I know what you're talking about now, Alyson, and I'm not quite sure that he puts an actual figure, but I think you're right about
but it's a similar contemplation about the absolute bloodbath that they have had on their 5-year mission. So I think this kind of encapsulates some of the things I like about the story and the things I don't like. Is at the end, Bones says something about how it's remarkable that he's come almost to the close of a 5-year mission with the crew and the ship intact. Like, he didn't say they were intact. He said they died by the dozens.
Yes.
Well, the current crew is intact.
Well, isn't every crew intact until some of them die? I mean,
no one cares about the red shirts.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
They're all intact except for the dead ones.
Yeah, 90 of them are dead, and 80 of them happen to be wearing red. So there you go.
Yeah.
But yeah.
All the credited cast are still alive, so...
Yeah.
All the guild members.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of timeline, this is at the end of the 5-year mission for the crew. In terms of Doctor Who's timeline, Larry, where would you place this?
I wasn't sure if this was right after the invasion of time, before meeting the White Guardian. I don't think it's as early as Deadly Assassin, but he was definitely traveling alone, and those are the 2 points that I could think of where that would hit. Also, knowing that Jean Airy grew up here and lived here in the Chicago area, she would have watched Doctor Who on Channel 11, like most of us, and probably had seen up to the Ribos operation, because they kept repeating after they did Invasion of Time, they kept repeating it back to Robot.
And ladies and gentlemen, that is the premium content you come here for. I want to shout Olay. That was phenomenal, Larry.
That is your Patreon dollars at work.
Wow.
I think that's where it is too. I think it has to be, because there's a reference to K9.
Yes.
But there's not a reference to Leela.
Right.
And there's a reference to him fixing K9.
Which would have been at the end of Invasion of Time.
I believe so.
So that's I think that's where it would be, and yeah, just remembering the time, because the story, her initial story was 1979, which, if I remember right, in 79, which is when you started watching the show, Tony.
Yes,
we were in an endless loop of Tom Baker episodes from Robot to Invasion of Time until they moved it to Sunday nights at 11 when they started with the Ribos operation.
Right.
So my guess is she hadn't seen it yet.
Mm-hmm. I think that's it. I think that must be it. Mm-hmm. So the fact that she knows about K9 and nothing that comes after that. So that means, in terms of our doing this in story order, we're actually about 2 stories early. Which is fine. Okay. I can live with that. It's our 100th episode. Right. We're allowed to indulge ourselves.
I thought that they were actually going to Leela's planet when they talked about how the society had split into technocrats and a more primitive people, but that it was a different planet. Is this a completely original planet?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, she appears to have come up with this techies and norms planet all on her own, because that's the other thing. That feels much more like a Star Trek planet than a Doctor Who universe planet. Societies like that don't really exist in the Doctor Who universe.
Except the one that Leela's from, which I understand there are different things at work there, but psychics and a split society is... That's the premise of that one. I mean, there are different evolutionary things going on.
That might have been a deliberate parallel. Mm-hmm. But as you say, when they get to that planet, it is a very different society.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And even the situation with the Daleks having placed bombs in orbit that come down to destroy bits of them doesn't feel like the Daleks. Like, they would destroy them. They would say, the hell with you guys, die, exterminate, boom, goodbye.
Yeah, the toying with them thing seemed... I didn't expect that to be the Daleks.
Well, that kind of fits, though, her experience having only watched 2 Dalek stories.
Oh, yeah.
So
I couldn't think of it.
That kind of fits. I mean, especially if she watched Destiny of the Daleks was her last one that she saw, then, then the bombs make total sense.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Oh, God. That's interesting to get the worldview of a fan who has only seen those Dalek stories. And maybe, well, I don't know. Would she have read the novelizations of the older ones?
I have no idea, because there were not very many Target books in our area in 1989, 79, 81. They were just starting to come in. I bought my first one in 81, and they had 4 titles in stock. And they were kind of testing the water with it. And then a few years later, the floodgates opened with it, but not when this story was written.
And at that point, would you have had to have gone to like a more specialty sci-fi bookshop?
Yes. You would have to go to a comic book store. And in Chicago, there was only 2 places that sold Target books in the city for the most part. Tony, I don't know where you got your books from, but I got mine from the Comic Connection in Morton Grove, and they had like basically 4 titles in stock, and they started getting more as time went on. But there was Larry's comic book store on Devon and Broadway, and he had a bunch more. He was importing them long before anybody else. But that was a couple bus rides for me at the time.
Man, by the time I moved to less than a mile from there, it was long gone.
Oh yeah, he's been gone for quite a long time.
And I got most of my books either from PBS's
Pledge Drive.
What do they call those? Yeah, Pledge Drives at PBS, or going into Bluefield, Virginia, Bluefield, West Virginia, where there was a large mall, and I think there was a little Professor bookstore, and they carried them.
Okay.
But that had to have been 82 or 83, because I remember that's where I got my copy of the novelization of The 5 Doctors that came out a week before it came out on TV.
Right. Yeah, that would have been about the 20th anniversary year is when, Lyle Stewart took over, and that's when more bookstores got Target books.
And that's exactly where I got most of mine. Either that or getting them from John Fitton in Britain, John Fitton in Britain, where you got one a month for subscription, which was awfully nice.
Oh, yeah.
But back to this.
Yes.
Back to this. Now that we know where to place it.
But that is, you said it's not a usual Target book. It seems like it would be challenging to discuss this story without discussing what the writer would have seen. and
Yeah,
read.
right.
And you've talked about this before a lot with the official novelizations of, different writers having access only to the script. They couldn't even rewatch the episode.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, you're right. That's absolutely germane to the
As
topic.
opposed to, like, Picard, which I thought was fabulous. Picard absolutely seems like the work of someone who sat down and watched original series through the end of Next Generation, possibly some Deep Space Nine as well, and wrote that story with all that fresh on the mind from having watched it in the previous couple of years. Like, I didn't even notice at the time that even in the music, the theme was the original Romulan theme music from '66.
Yes.
But
Yep.
we take for granted now that if you have the time and a very modest amount of money, you can do that. It's possible. And at this time, she wouldn't have even been able to do that, even if she had an unlimited budget.
Yeah, someone could sit down and do a fan work just from looking at clips online or looking it up on Wikipedia. They would not have to have sat through hours and hours, and unfortunately, some of that fan fiction reads like it.
Yeah.
This, however, doesn't, which is why I'm really surprised by it, because even the Star Trek stuff, come to think of it, because she would have had to have caught Star Trek in syndication. I'm not sure that, who knows whether she had a VCR at that time. I know we didn't get ours until like 82. So, yeah.
The sort of zeitgeist of the late 60s through early 80s here is that sort of preoccupation with mind control as well, as part of a
Yeah.
sort of pseudo-sexual bondage power exchange kind of thing you have. And it just seems like a lot of genre fiction from mid-60s through early 80s that works really well for both of those series in that queasy way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And speaking of queasy, does that mean we should transition over to the stuff that didn't work quite so well? Yeah, we've been asked by Alyson to wait about talking about the elephant in the room, so I want to get some of the more minor negative things out of the way before we press on into that big hairy ball of furriness.
Right.
There are no tribbles for those who have not read it. There are not literal hairy balls of furriness. That would have actually been a lot more self-indulgent.
That's true. That is
Yes.
true, in fact. Oh, Tribbles would have loved the Doctor. Oh, my God. What did we not like about this?
Well, we've already kind of touched on how weird and awful the illustrations are.
But those are not the writer's fault, right?
No, but it's
No.
still part of what we had to look at.
Larry is subjecting us to content on screen now. He may never be forgiven.
I just don't understand the decision for this really like caricature boardwalk style of drawing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, you can buy the original artwork still on eBay for $25 a print.
But why would you?
That's why they're still out there.
I would be surprised if you told me it was the originals for $25.
Right.
Those are the originals. Yeah, they're
Those are the originals.
Tom Holcomb.
Yeah.
That's his
can't
eBay
offload them.
channel because I had read that he had put them up for sale, so I went looking, and they're still up there.
Oh, God.
It's-
I know why.
It's just
They're
it's just such an odd decision. Like what
Yeah.
what was in their head that said this is going to make people take this serious?
Well, I think you have to look back at the fanzines of the time and the culture.
So it's again kind of okay. Yeah.
Yeah, because here's something else, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, but fan art is either really, really good to the point of almost being professional, or it's like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there is a market for it. There is a market for this sort of fan artwork. And God bless them. Via con Dios, that's exactly, if they like that, they should have it. But you're right, there is this strange kind of queasy mix of a really serious story, except for the party scene, but we'll get there. And this.
Well, it's the classic conflict you get with comic covers, oftentimes, that are such a mismatch in the tone and the art style of the interior, where if you bought the comic because you really loved what was suggested by that cover, you would not be happy with the content. You're like, this isn't the same style. This isn't the same tone of story. This is what I thought I was buying. And then also conversely, people who might have been really interested in that book will look at the cover like, no, that's not the kind of thing that I like. So if I had seen a book like this and thumbed through it, presumably I would have seen it like for sale by a person in a box in an alley, or like, you know, with a raincoat opening up and showing me, you know, bootleg fanzine for sale or something. I'm not sure.
You're pretty accurate there, Alyson.
You're very close.
I'm sure we'll get the whole story of how the author didn't market it, but it was kind of appropriated. But I would have thought, you know, yeah, I'm not really into that like kind of zany Mad Magazine style thing for something that's this long. Like that might be a funny couple of pages or something like that. But it would have been something I actually would have been interested to read, and I would have been put off thinking it was something totally different. And if I wanted to read something the art suggested, I would have been put off by this story.
Yeah.
Yeah, as I was way back in the 80s.
Well, and I'm looking back through it too, and it's like they're not all horrible, but of the drawings, most of the ones of Tom Baker are the ones that are so unappealing and like super cartoony. Like even the caricatures of Kirk and Spock and McCoy and Uhura, they're caricature-y, but they still kind of look like them.
Yeah.
That caricature of Tom Baker is just so unnerving that it will haunt like us. It's so toothy and his nose is so big. It's such an amplification, whereas the other ones are still at least close to looking like them without being goofy.
So I'm curious about the vintage because we had two completely different illustration styles. One of which was like Dalton said, like a professional boardwalk caricaturist who actually makes an honest living drawing caricatures. And then some that were like I say middle school level, but it's about the level that I could produce, that are like full figure drawings of some scene or whatever. But then there's work that appears to be produced by a Photoshop filter that I don't think existed until the early 90s.
No, you're right.
And that really confused me as how people were producing that in like 1984. So when were these abominations brought into the world?
Oh, 1984 is the first abomination. Actually, a little earlier than that.
The second woe was coming quickly.
Yeah, 84 would be the first time that appeared. Of course, it was a fan magazine when it appeared in actual mainstream. But before that, it was underground. Yeah. So there has been a lot of illustrations on this story.
So my confusion is about the timeline of when Arri was distributing this, and then when someone else, do I understand correctly, appropriated it and sold it without permission, and that party added illustrations?
Some of the original illustrations were used.
Okay, so which are the original illustrations? I didn't know there were originals.
Well, the original illustrations you haven't seen.
Oh, okay.
Ah.
And I can't even show those to you because that where it appeared, I'll cover that more in the collector's side, but it appeared in a fanzine that is basically out of print and out of reach.
I thought you were going to say they were so powerful that we couldn't survive seeing them.
Yeah, I'm sure. I don't even know. I couldn't even tell you. But there was also some drawings done by Gail Bennett, who, if you know the name, she did all the illustrations for Fantasy Empire.
Yeah,
which were actually quite good.
Very good.
She used to come to the conventions in the 80s, and she would basically sit at a table and draw original artwork, which was really good. But that only appeared in one publication of this, and then when it went to Enterprise Magazine, that's when they hired this Tom Holkampf guy to draw the artwork, and it's the artwork you've been subjected to.
Oh, okay.
So that's and that's not the worst of it yet. When Pioneer Books did it, they took it to the worst level. So.
Yes. You can actually see the cover of that one if you do a Google search or if you go on Amazon.
Here it is right here.
Even though, yeah.
And there are illustrations in this as well that are pretty bad.
Yeah. Yeah, severely bad.
The first thing that I thought was kind of a eye roll was the 24-hour mandated bed rest when they're all going to die. And the doctor is like holding court in the sick bay with jelly babies. So that was the first thing that Steve contrived, and the next weirdness was the party, was what I would say, after we get to the third great weirdness.
The party with the top hat and the tuxedo.
Yeah. Oh,
where they're also possibly going to die soon, but they have time.
and in which Uhura sings the filk.
Yes.
Yes, we need to talk about what a filk is. a filk is...
Do we need to talk to our doctors about it?
Yeah, you do. You do. Talk to your doctor about filk. Yeah, some of the side effects may include athlete's head and the desire to die. Yeah, filks tend to be songs that either have... It's the existing tune and you've got new lyrics to it that have to do with a particular fandom. Or you have songs that are original songs that I'm sorry, this is my opinion, are by and large horrible about an existing fandom. Like the Lady Hawk songs I used to be subjected to by the same fan friend, and I hated every single one of them.
About the movie Lady Hawk?
Yes. Yes. The movie Lady Hawk, yes. There's a whole goddamn cassette of songs about fucking Lady Hawk, and it's just
that's some fan
abysmal.
wink dedication.
Yeah. In fact, Larry probably knows the artist that I'm talking about. I can't remember her name, but she basically specialized in doing filk albums, and I can't stand any of them. However, Uhura at the party sings a song that Aerie quite rightly describes as never having been all that popular, called My Friend the Doctor from the movie Dr. Dolittle.
You would. Maybe what the doctor tells me isn't altogether true, but I love every tale he tells me. I don't know any better ones. Do you? My friend the doctor says the world is full of...
And apparently there are new lyrics to it that Uhura has made up, and I'm so glad. I have to say, I have to give the Ghost of Jean Aerie props for having the restraint not to put those lyrics in the book.
I agree. I thought that did show remarkable
Yeah.
restraint. You think it might be the centerpiece for some people.
Yeah, I would have thrown it against the wall.
Yeah.
I would not have gone further.
Yet that is a thing that Uhura does in at least one episode. She sings, these sort of extemporaneous...
improv,
she improvises songs about people who are hanging out in the lounge.
That's true.
But
that is
usually they're hanging out in the lounge in less death-threatening circumstances.
Right.
Yeah. I recall in the episode Charlie X, she starts singing about Charlie, and then he quite rightly freezes her vocal cords and causes Spock's lyre not to be able to play.
Right.
It's like,
Oh my god.
yeah.
It is the only time in the episode where he's pretty sympathetic.
Yes, indeed.
He wants to use
Exactly
his powers
right.
for good.
Right. What else did we dislike?
Well, there's, speaking of just weird things that were put in there, the yo-yo championship.
Oh,
The Andorran yo-yo contest.
the Andorran yo-yo contest. Christ almighty.
That was in the trailer, more fun than an Andorran yo-yo contest.
Yeah, it seemed like the jelly babies being used to create plot points and the yo-yos as well, with Kirk actually having to use a yo-yo to turn off the
Dalek prisoner's machine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chekhov's
it's
yo-yo.
ridiculous.
Chekhov's yo-yo, yes.
Yes.
Well, as you know, I think that all Star Trek stories should star Bones. So I actually did like the part of the jelly babies that gave him opportunity to carp, persuade the medical staff to join a feast of jelly babies. What are those?
Yes.
They're assorted
I can hear
flavors.
him ranting. Yeah.
But I guess I liked them less for themselves than for providing material.
Yeah.
You also get the obligatory McCoy line, "Damn it, I'm a doctor, not a butcher."
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Which I thought was the only, real cringe reference. I don't know.
Really?
Yeah, well, but I guess this wasn't a cliche yet by then. The damn it, Jim,
yeah.
I'm a doctor, not a insert noun or occupation here. I guess,
Yeah.
I think that was 20 years after that when, once again, we had freer access to episodes that became sort of a running joke. Damn it, Jim, I'm a doctor, none of that.
Yeah.
Right.
So at the time, maybe it wouldn't have been quite so worn out.
Okay. And I guess we should address the elephant in the room now. Because part of the plot involves Kirk getting infected by a virus which is essentially caused by unrestrained psychic activity. And it's caused...
And because he didn't get his COVID shot, right?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. or use a condom. Yeah, a mental condom. I wish I had one for that part of the book. He looks lasciviously at a girl who looks lasciviously back at him, and that's what does it, folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. That's
and gets
what
him
does
into
it.
a boatload of trouble.
And almost kills him.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a little too early to be an AIDS metaphor. So,
Yes.
though it could be, I'm not really sure. I wish I could
Probably
have asked
not, because of when
Yeah.
AIDS was publicly disclosed was a couple years into the Reagan administration. So I'm guessing no, but it definitely, when I first read it, that went right over my head. But of course, when I read it again, I was like, oh.
Yeah.
It was like a What Women Want kind of thing, where the thoughts were out loud and everybody could hear them, and that kind of thing. It was kind of, forward for the time, I thought.
Mm-hmm.
I found everything that happened on the planet having to do with the virus confusing, not in that, I think that's a bad plot point, but I kept rereading things to understand the sequence of events, and I still somehow didn't get that was supposed to be the point of transmission.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
But that's when he got it.
Yeah, I think the only reason he gets it is because he doesn't get the inoculation from Dorsey Stevens.
I thought there were other people on the Enterprise who had gotten it. They treated...
Yeah, he was supposed to see her before going outside, and he didn't do it.
Right, because he's Kirk.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I don't have time for that.
Yeah, and the doctor told him to wait, and that was the other bone of contention.
Right.
What do we do with that?
So that wasn't actually the part that I would say bothered me, because I didn't even understand that's when he caught the virus.
Okay, I think I know what did bother you, so why don't you
go for
ahead
it,
and tell
yeah.
us.
There's so much to choose
Yeah.
from. I want to see if you guessed right.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
well, there
I would
is
be
a
like a
slap.
prism where everyone's horrified by something different.
Well, there is the slap, and there is a bit of, well, not exactly victim blaming, because Kirk is accused of essentially mind rape. And then his accuser turns out to have, how do we say this? Essentially foisted herself upon him, if that makes sense, even
Right.
though that wasn't
Yeah.
her place to do, and then she gets slapped for it by one of the men, who essentially says, know your place, woman, kinda. That I had some real issue with.
Yeah.
Once again, I found it challenging to understand some of the sequence of events here. Maybe that's because they didn't make any sense. So it's by far the rapiest thing, or not, it's not, turns out to not be a rapey story. The most messed up rape-themed story that we have seen in any of these stories, and I think maybe even more than the original series, and that's saying something, because the original series definitely had some, anyone would love to be raped by Kirk, overtones at times.
Yep.
Yeah.
Where it was this bizarre fantasy that I generally vociferously opposed to gender essentialism, so I'm not proud to say, I looked back at the name to say, okay, this is Jean, Jean, did a woman actually write this?
I wonder that too.
So,
Yeah.
the story, if I understood it, is that because there are two women, one of whom is the good one, one of whom is the bad one, in very unqualified terms. All right, so Nimona. Nimona
Right.
is standing around with some very lush and lusty eyelashes. And they're so thick and beautiful, but she still managed to see Kirk through them, which is really saying something, apparently, considering how voluminous and lovely the eyelashes are. He thinks that she is a hottie. She looks at him and also finds him quite hot. He is thinking sexy thoughts, and then suddenly she is horrified and scandalized at the extremely explicit nature of the thoughts, that we're not privy to the exact nature of them, and is horrified and claims that he raped her psychically. As I understood it to be always that there was a mutual flirtation. She's looking at him, he's looking at her, she's looking back in a very deliberate way. He is thinking some R and X-rated thoughts, and then she is horrified, fabricates a rape claim out of whole cloth, and reports it, and he is sentenced to trial by combat.
Yes.
During which the most powerful psychic on the planet, who apparently people can also just order around at will, mind reads the psychic girl on a planet with a lot of psychics on it. They just thought at this point to maybe do some kind of investigation. Figures out she was lying, publicly shames her. Like, it is like the worst MRA fantasy I've ever read. No, it's this bizarre fantasy wherein it is a folk belief among many people that there is a whole common genre wherein a person claims to have been raped after they participated in some kind of consensual sexual flirtation or sexual contact. And what is so powerful in fiction is that the writer writes the whole story. So they write it in such a way that that is always a lie. As if this is a common thing that happens. And it's like murder clowns. There was a murder clown. John Wayne Gacy was our personal area murder clown. That is something that has happened. But the frequency of murder clowns, and I know I've used this before on previous podcasts, I apologize, but it is pertinent. In the words of Lisa Simpson, it is apt, I tell you, apt. The preponderance of murder clowns in fiction far outpaces the occurrence of murder clowns in our actual world. And I thought it couldn't get any worse, and then it got worse, and then worse and worse as the story went on. But that was my understanding of the original incident.
I think that tracks right. Yeah, because I think all of us probably got to that point and went, whoa, okay, did that actually need to be there at all? Because one of the negatives I find about this entire book is that even though it roughly goes for about 62 pages, or at least that's how many pages it was in our PDF, it still feels overlong. It feels like it needs some judicious editing. It needs less incident, not more. And somehow that bit on the planet of the norms and the techies, or whatever they're called, doesn't feel like it is absolutely necessary. It feels like it's thrown in there just to somehow give Kirk his comeuppance for being such a ladies' man in the original series, or them having written him that way. It felt a little bit like a take that.
See, I thought it was the opposite. I thought Kirk sees someone attractive who's flirting with him. He flirts back a little, and then this terrible thing happens. I thought Kirk was supposed to be very sympathetic in that situation.
Right. But he's still punished in some ways for behavior that he exhibits all the time in the show.
But not like he is in, like, for example, the 2009 remake, where Kirk is
that's true,
kind of sexually shamed in that way, but he is embarrassed because he's used to being the hottest person in the room and someone is hotter. Like, it's different than this.
Yeah, that's true.
This is more like, watch out for bitches, they lie. Which is different than zip it up, Kirk.
Yeah, that is a point.
Yeah, it's kind of low
But then it
lead
got
up.
so much worse. When Eldona, because that's a name, not a title apparently in this place, comes and visits him and explains that, okay, we're aware that the 8th century BC Greeks left us the most misogynistic writings of the ancient world, right? Unfortunately, also the most prolific and well put together. There is an Athenian writing where some highborn man is boasting that the women in his family are so well-bred that they're embarrassed even to look at other men in their household, and this is what a respectable lady is. This isn't quite that bad, but we have this woman who is described alternatively as responding very submissively to Raoul, who apparently can just order her around, and other times is described as being a very powerful person in society, explaining that women do not make eye contact with strange men, and that strange men are mostly any man outside of the family. And it completely contradicts everything else we see that character do.
Yep.
But it's shown as a sympathetic moment of folk wisdom.
Yeah.
Wherein, of course, this is not to imprison women, it's for their own protection. Otherwise, they could easily be psychically raped. And also, I am having this private meeting with you, the stranger, in this situation, where I explain to you our society as we violate the Billy Graham rule. I mean, it's really such a bizarre mix of contradictory factors that remind me of, I apologize in advance, you can edit this out, I'm going to talk about celebrity pastors, but I won't name names. Okay. But about 10 years ago, a celebrity pastor, famously caught in a men's room situation with another man. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And another celebrity pastor commented that something to the effect of, I'm going to take one for the team and say what everyone else is not manly enough to say. If that guy's wife hadn't let herself go, he would never have had that affair. Everyone's like, God. Okay, actually, that doesn't make any sense at all. That would make sense with him hooking up with the woman at the Clinique counter. And this feels the same, where it's supposed to feel like a moment of sort of raw, real talk, but it actually doesn't make any sense within the context of the story. And that actually frustrated me more than anything else.
I definitely see that, because you're right. There's an internal inconsistency there that really isn't there in the rest of the book.
Well, but then it comes back at the end with the transmission of the virus. Yeah. Wherein we're told that it's linked to puberty, and Nimona is specifically twice referred to, once to her face and once behind her back, as having cooked up this entire thing because she is childish. She is still a child. She's being literally sent back to some kind of nursery, I guess because she doesn't understand how to be flattered by Kirk's thoughts. And it's clear like an insult. You're not ready for the adult world. You are a child. But then later we have this fairly technical explanation about how puberty affects the symptoms of the virus. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't make sense at all with the insults that are paid to her earlier. Like, it's a very physical thing. I don't know if I don't understand the plot mechanics or there's nothing there to understand.
I don't think there's that much there to understand. I think that's the one part of this entire book where Aries' plotting falls apart quite a bit.
But it's so detailed that I feel like I'm just missing a point that he's trying to make that's probably horrible, but I'm just not quite getting it.
I didn't get it either. In fact, at that point, I was like, okay, let's just hope that this passes quickly and we get some knowledge.
And it doesn't. It keeps coming back again and again.
Yeah.
Like my discussion of it. It keeps going.
Well, that's definitely a negative of it. So certainly that. Any other negatives we can think of before heading into our own opinions of this in general?
Well, much like I felt like the Daleks were just kind of thrown in to be a link to Doctor Who, I felt the same way about the Sontarans.
Oh, God, yeah.
You were talking about there needed to be a lot of editing. It felt like the whole section with them being attacked by Sontarans was just a way to kind of talk about the Sontarans, and we don't even really interact with an actual Sontaran. We just get ships that the Enterprise very easily deals with.
Yes.
Even though we're told that the Sontarans are formidable and they will destroy whoever they need to get what they want, but it just was like, why go through all of this discussion of how strong they are and how much they don't care about losing their own people, and then the Enterprise gets attacked and they blow them up, and it's like, okay, on to wherever we need to go next.
Yes, and it mostly happens off screen. In fact, every major incident in this book, there's a lot of talk about it, there's a lot of lead up to it, and then when it happens, it's described in a couple of paragraphs, and then we move on to the next thing.
Which is in some ways the most target book part of the story.
Yes.
Well, it's often seen some opponent built up as this formidable villain, very clever, very powerful, and then they're punched in the face or someone throws a stick of dynamite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you're right, Dalton, and I think the only reason why they were thrown in is because I agree with Larry where the placement of the story must have been. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can't say more than that, but I think there's a very good reason why the Sontarans are in it. It's just...
Which I think that is, too, why I felt like this was more of a Star Trek story than a Doctor Who story.
Yeah.
Because we get so much more of the vibe of Star Trek. We don't really get any feel for anything from the Doctor Who universe.
Yeah.
Even though there's a lot of stuff brought up, a lot of the technology, talking about the TARDIS, the Doctor, Daleks, Sontaran, Sonic Screwdriver. We get all these little references, but it feels very superficial and it feels very much just like name dropping.
Yeah.
Well, it's never the Doctor's perspective. It's Kirk's perspective and then Bones'
Right.
perspective and then back to Kirk, but never the Doctor, and he doesn't have any supporting cast there.
Right. And I think
Right.
it probably would have made more sense if the Doctor had ended up in the Star Trek universe. Because usually when you get these crossovers, that's what happens. One of our reviewers for Goodreads, in fact, talks about having read the Legion of Superheroes ends up on the Enterprise D. And yes, the X-Men also do at one point. And it's like, why would you do such a horrible thing? And yet when they do, they travel forward in time, but they're in the Star Trek universe. It's not, the other way around. And this one doesn't feel like it is the other way around, even though it's meant to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, even the Daleks seem odd.
Yeah.
It reads like someone who knows Star Trek characters very well and Doctor Who not very well. I say, which sounds like exactly the situation, based on, Larry, what you've described, she would have been able to watch.
Yeah, she wouldn't have had nearly as much access to the Doctor Who universe at that time as she had to Star Trek. And that makes some sense. That definitely makes sense.
So how many stories would that have been that she would have had access to?
Not very many. In 1979, she probably wouldn't have had access to any Target books, but the Star Trek original series was in constant repeat, and only the early Tom Bakers up to Invasion of Time were being broadcast in our area.
Yes. That and Star Trek had a much more active fan and fanzine community in the United States than Doctor Who did. As a matter of fact, the fact that she did this is probably why we're still talking about it, because it was probably one of the first major uses of Doctor Who in a fanzine story, as far as I know.
Yep, that's true.
How many? This was published in 4 parts, was it?
Yeah, it was broken up into 4 parts for publication in Enterprise magazine across 4 issues.
And that would have been, I hesitate to say the leading fanzine for Star Trek fandom, but certainly it was one of the big guns.
It was a big mainstream one.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. So, shall we go to Goodreads?
Yes.
Yes. But we don't run out of time because this is going to be a big one. All right, let's find out what our Goodreads people had to say, as we always do. Let's go to goodreads.com for online reviews of the book written by other readers and follow up with our own ratings. By the way, if you're listening to this podcast and want to have your review featured when we get to an upcoming book or simply have a question about it, read the book, write a review, or comment in our Goodreads group by the deadline so that we have a chance to see it. You may get your review read out loud here. The average rating for this book on Goodreads out of 5 stars is 2.95. Not terribly high. The reviews from our Goodreads group have again been edited for length. Sorry everyone, but keep them coming. In our Goodreads group, Michael gives this book 2 stars and says back in the days before you could easily find just about anything you wanted on the internet, we had to go to conventions and scour the dealer's room to find nuggets like this one. Which is what a friend of mine and I did back in the day, agreeing to share a copy of this and the Doctor Who magazines we picked up. I don't recall much about this one other than it feeling a bit underwhelming and not really worth the price tag we paid to finally read it. I am sure I could easily track it down today, but honestly, I'm not sure if it would be more or less enjoyable than when I first read it 30 or so years ago. Our Patreon Dave Davis also gives it 2 stars and says, like most fan fiction that I've read, this could have used some proofreading and editing. Though, to be fair, the version I read was online, and many of the small mistakes might have been transcription errors. Unlike most of the fan fiction I've read, the writing style was pretty consistent all the way through. There were no sudden changes of tense or descriptive passages giving way to terse script-like dialogue. The Star Trek characters seemed to me to be portrayed accurately, especially the libidinous Kirk. For the most part, the Doctor was too, though he was, for example, a little too keen for the Enterprise crew to launch a preemptive strike against the Sontarans. It's not that the Doctor wouldn't have done this, just that he would have done it a little regretfully. For all its faults, if this book had been properly commissioned, edited, and published, I certainly would have bought it. As it's unlikely that that'll ever happen, not least because of rights issues, I'm content that I was able to while away a rainy afternoon with this entertaining story. And finally, Mark gives it 3 stars and says, after picking up the first issue of Star Trek The Next Generation Doctor Who Assimilation 2 from IDW Publishing, yes, that's the full title, I decided to take a trip back in time and read what is probably the first Trek Who crossover by Gene Airy. There are a dozen different printed editions of this book. I read the original text, which is available online, which was published in 1982. The verdict? Ms. Airy tells an interesting tale, but it's mostly a character study of Kirk, Spock, and the Doctor. The plot meanders quite a bit. The Enterprise finds itself in the Doctor's universe, needing his help to get back home. Kirk is suspicious of the Doctor's motives, but is won over. I like the story, but it doesn't really go anywhere, so this is probably only for hardcore Trekkies and Whovians with some curiosity. Yeah. So, Larry, out of 5 stars, what would you give this?
I would give this 2.5.
Okay.
And the reasoning for that is that it is a Star Trek story featuring the Doctor, where the title suggests it's a Doctor Who story featuring Star Trek. Yeah. And some of the issues that we've talked about here too, kind of led me to the same conclusions about, when I read it as an adult versus when I read it when I was 12 or 13. So definitely a different story than what I had remembered back in the day, but not as great. And again, there's more to the story as far as why we got this raw version of it, and there's no editing and no polishing. But that's where I would give it.
Okay. And Alyson?
I know this doesn't sound accurate, but I have actually practiced restraint by not reading aloud my 2 pages of quotes from Bones that I have on here that I enjoyed. And I am absolutely the target audience for outstanding Bones content. So this is another one where there are a lot of things that I really, really enjoyed. And then we have this bucket, I was going to say cold water in the middle, but really it's some untreated sewage where everything feels too high or too low. So I think about reading it as if I had read this first as a teen, how I would have been absolutely over the moon with so much of it, and including the very cheesy parts, and then would have been just sort of hit in the face by this dehumanizing storyline of the young woman in the middle and towards the end of the story. So I think I'm going to go 2, but it seems both way too high and way too low in ways. There is one prejudicially edited quote I would like to read aloud. Kirk's body heaved with a convulsive spasm, ellipses. The Doctor was the one who held his body as the spasm subsided, ellipses. He's made it, Spock, McCoy whispered. You can edit that out.
That was actually very enjoyable.
No,
For them as well.
The McCoy content, but also the 2 different kinds of parallels she drew between Kirk and the Doctor that did not quickly and easily resolve. And then also the mind meld after effects between the Doctor and Spock, I thought were actually terrific storylines. And then the main plot made no sense at all.
Yeah, that's true. All right. And Dalton?
I'm going to agree with Alyson. I would give this 2. There are some good character moments. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on. Like I said earlier in the podcast, the bromance between the Doctor and Spock it's charming. I really liked seeing their interplay. But yeah, the actual story itself just is too meandering. It's too it needed to be focused. It needed to be edited. If there was more kind of a clear understanding of where this was going, I would feel better about it. Also, like I said earlier, the bits with the Doctor, or at least things from the Doctor Who universe, feel hollow. There doesn't seem to be a lot of care placed in those. They're really just there to kind of let us know that we're in the Doctor Who universe. But it was enjoyable. I'm not expecting, fan fiction to be the best Pulitzer Prize winning writing, but I enjoyed reading this. It was fun. It was interesting to see the crossover. So for what it is, I would give it a 2.
Okay. And as for me, I think I agree with the panel in general that it's not bad written fan fiction. As a matter of fact, it's some of the better written fan fiction that I've read. You don't have some of the markers that you have of truly awful fan fiction, such as a Mary Sue character. And we get that designation from Star Trek fan fiction, as a matter of fact, directly. So that's how bad it could be. We don't have characters acting out of character, at least not on the Star Trek side. The Doctor doesn't feel right from time to time. He does get that very nice doctorish, Tom Bakerish speech about the Centaurans, and some of the byplay is nice, but then the mind meld scene is particularly strange. It just doesn't sound like him. And it is much more of a Star Trek story than a Doctor Who story. It's not a bad Star Trek story, but it's a meandering one. And it does have some of those issues. So yeah, I'd say 2 out of 5. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you, fellow time travelers, for giving us your valuable time. Stay tuned for the continuation of this joint episode with the Doctor Who Collectors Podcast. And next time, join myself, J.G. McQuarrie, and Jenny Ingersoll for our discussion of Terrence Dick's novelization of Underworld, or as they call it, The Underworld. I know, it's kind of strange. In the meantime, if you liked what you've heard here, like us on Facebook at Doctor Who Target Book Club Podcast, all in words with no spaces. Also, feel free to follow us on Twitter. We're at DWTargetBC, or subscribe to us via the podcast provider of your choice, including Spotify. If all else fails you, and it inevitably will, email me directly at emperordolak@gmail.com with Target Book Club in the subject line so I don't ignore it. Thank you very much for listening. Stay safe and enjoy your travels. And now, here's Fraser Hines singing Who is Doctor Who?
They all say, who is Doctor Who? Where is he from? What does he do? They wonder who is Doctor Who? So I ask you,
Welcome back to the Doctor Who Collectors Podcast, the podcast that explores the collaborative world of Doctor Who collecting, those who collect, issues surrounding collecting, and of course, Doctor Who merchandise of all kinds. I am Larry VanMersbergen, your host, and I've been collecting Doctor Who since 1981. In the winter of '84, I had this really ridiculous idea to open a Doctor Who store here in Chicago and called it Bundles from Britain. And we were dealers at the TARDIS 22 convention in November 1985. And we're mentioned in a wonderful book that every collector needs on their shelf, and it's called Red, White, and Who, the Story of Doctor Who in America. Bundles from Britain lives on page 384. And if you want to find a copy of this book, there's a link on our homepage at DoctorWhoCollectors.com that will take you directly to the book. We don't earn anything from it, but we just want everyone to have it. And speaking of links, 2 great resources for your collectors out there include timelash.com to keep track of your books, vinyl, and CD collection for no cost, with special thanks to Dan O'Malley. If you're not sure what you have or need to find what you have, look it up at Howe's Transcendental Toy Box at drwhotoybox.co.uk. David J. Howe is a great friend of ours and is a great resource for collectors. And if you're looking for great Doctor Who items at great prices, including Star Trek items, look no further than DoctorWhoStore.com. Alien Entertainment has what you need. Visit our website at DoctorWhoCollectors.com to see the newest offerings from Forbidden Planet. Your purchases keep us on the air. And don't forget to sign up now for Chicago TARDIS 2021, returning to a in-person convention, at least at this press release. Guests include Colin Baker, the Sixth Doctor, Simon Fisher Becker, the great Doria Maldivar, Sadie Miller, the daughter of Elizabeth Sladen, who is, of course, reprising Sarah Jane Smith in the Big Finish stories, and, of course, no convention is complete without Fraser Hines. More to be announced, so keep ChicagoTardis.com in your bookmarks and experience the best Doctor Who convention in the Midwest. I am very honored to be their collecting expert, so stop by and see the collecting panel in person or you can visit the virtual convention we did last year by going to the Chicago TARDIS YouTube or Facebook page or our YouTube channel playlist. And be sure to visit the live taping of the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast that they do every November. Very happy to be part of the Target Book Club podcast's 100th episode in this special, never before done, as far as I know, joint podcast. So my guests are Tony Whitt, Dalton Hughes, and Alyson Fitch-Safreed. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
So we're going to talk about the Doctor and the Enterprise, which we just got done thoroughly reviewing. So I hope, and of course, if you're my listener and you were confused by the first hour or so, don't be confused. This was a planned event, and we're so far in the middle of a great discussion on this incredible book. Nancy Jean Airy, of course, we lost her in 2016, born in 1943, lived mostly in Aurora, worked for Lucent Technologies, as we mentioned. She was a very regular fixture in the 1980s Star Trek creation conventions, which probably prompted the writing of this crossover. So just to kind of go backwards, if you're not old enough to remember these, Creation Con, which is still operating today, used to operate these what we call Star Trek and the token Doctor Who guest conventions here in Chicago at the Congress Hotel. And they were done from 1981 till about 1987, 88 or so. So you would actually go to the convention and you could meet, Walter Koenig and Sarah Sutton, which was pretty random. Or you could meet Leonard Nimoy and, somebody from Doctor Who. I think Michael Craze was here at one point. Patrick Troughton did one of them. So there was a lot of mixture of the two worlds, and the world of Star Trek in that early 80s time was extremely strong. There was Starfleet Academy, which they had uniforms, they had staff cars, they had ranks, insignia. It was a serious deal. So I don't know if my distinguished panel here has experienced any of that. Tony, did you do any of those when you were younger?
No. In fact, the earliest convention I ever did was something called, what was it called? Media West. And
okay.
Yeah, and
okay.
That would have been late 80s, early 90s, I believe. But yeah, I didn't meet an actual celebrity guest until I moved down south, and that was in the mid-90s.
Okay, gotcha. Alyson or Dalton, any experiences with that?
Not until the 2000s for me.
Okay.
Yeah, no, back in North Carolina where I grew up, there was a comic book convention in Charlotte, but it, mostly was comic book cosplays and things like that. I didn't really go to any of the meet and greets, but I wish I would have been more involved with it. So
yeah, it was quite something. And of course, when I was active with Bundles from Britain in the 84-85 year, I probably did 30 conventions that year, and most of them were these creation cons. And they were very inexpensive as a dealer. I think the table was $100, and it was all for all 3 days. It was a really great deal. And so it was great to also, we stocked a lot of Star Trek memorabilia as, to probably boost business. We got into the comic books and the trade paperbacks and whatever was available at that time. And I do remember meeting briefly Jean Airy. She was doing a talk about fan fiction, and I remember she talked about her stories, and one of them was the Doctor and the Enterprise. At this point in time, the book hadn't been published as of yet, but I think it was getting there. But Enterprise magazine had been published at this point, and of course there was a dealer there that had a bunch of those, so we negotiated buying those because those became very popular at the time, and the Star Trek Doctor Who worlds kind of collided. Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan was still a very popular movie at that time, and so the Star Trek fandom was really big in Chicago. So a lot of that, and of course we talked about this in the first part of this, but when she wrote this in 1979, her access to Doctor Who was limited, but the access to the entire Star Trek series was pretty thorough. The first time it was ever published, and I'll go right into the fanzine, and just to educate the audience a little bit, a fanzine, of course, is a magazine produced by amateurs for fans of a particular performer, group, or form of entertainment. There were over 500 Star Trek and more than 1,000 Doctor Who fanzines that have been printed since the 70s, and those are the ones that I could find out about. Many more. Some of them were completely underground, in other words, only available through certain connections. For instance, in the Doctor Who world, the Many Companions of Doctor Who fan club produced a fanzine. All of them are lost, including copies I had. They were lost in a flood back in 1987. The Emissaries of the White Guardian from Skokie, all of them are lost. There was a story called Doctor Who and the Masked Digressor, which would actually be a great story for the Target Book Club. It was written by award-winning author Rhonda Del Bacchio.
Oh, wow.
And Rhonda and I knew each other. We met each other in the Many Companions of Doctor Who. She was a member of that club, and she wrote that story, and it was basically put out with binder clips and was sold for $2. So I actually reached out to Rhonda. She's looking through her basement to see if she can find a copy. Then she'd be freely willing to share it.
Oh, fantastic.
I only know if any exist, she has them. There's a great fanzine site called the Doctor Who Fanzine Preservation Project. It's a university site, so if you Google that, you'll find it pretty fast. And just to let you know that the very first fanzine was actually a Star Trek publication, and it was called Spockanalia. And it was it's a great title. It was published in September 1967 by members of the Lunarians, and some of the earliest examples of academic freedom were written on Star Trek fanzines, specifically the Kirk Spock Slash. Mm-hmm. And that was a very popular genre for those fanzines. And they continued well through the 70s, mostly on mimeographed paper, usually given away, and they weren't sold. It's a really interesting phenomena. Now, this story, Doctor and the Enterprise, made its appearance in a fanzine called R&R. And just to, again, R&R was a Navy term for basically fooling around with the local women ashore. And it was eventually but it goes to the Navy, and that's true, as far as what they did. So the original series, you'll see things like TOS, which stands for Star Trek: The Original Series, or TNG, The Next Generation. So if you're looking for particular fanzines for those particular stories, you'll find those in those categories. So usually there's an anthology containing, this R&R was an anthology containing general stories and heterosexual stories, often explicit. At least 2 issues contained Slash, but not Kirk and Spock, and occasional nonfiction. The fanzine ran for 23 regular issues and 2 special issues, and a 3rd edition called The Shuttlecraft Incident was proposed, but it never happened. So many of Gene Airy stories appeared in that fanzine called R&R. It is completely out of print. The author or the publisher of that fanzine suffered a fire, and all of his original manuscripts were lost. So that would have appeared in 1981. That's the first time that the Doctor and the Enterprise appeared in its full format, along with the sequel, The Doctor and the Lieutenant, which I'll talk about more in a moment. The next time you see this is in 1982 on a fanzine called Zeta Minor, and it was a standalone publication of the Doctor and the Enterprise. It was a free publication. If you sent Gene a self-stamped envelope, remember those self-addressed stamped envelopes?
Yep.
and you included enough postage, I think, for $1.25, you could get a copy of the Zeta Minor for free. There are copies floating around. I do not have one in the collection as of yet, but one is on the way. So I did locate one. And there were 2 covers. Both covers were done by Gail Bennett, and they're really, actually, the artwork is much better. In the Gail Bennett, the reprint was done in 1983. So in 1984, when basically that's the year, and the year I got inspired to basically go into business was the year that the convention started happening, and fans started getting together, more fan clubs were being formed, and so New Media Publications was starting to publish magazines. There was, Fantasy Empire for the Doctor Who and the British fans, and Enterprise. So Enterprise came out in 1984. This is the first issue. I'll put pictures of these on the website, but just for our panelists here, I'm showing a copy of the Enterprise. And this had part 1 of the Doctor and the Enterprise. Also, plans for building your own starship, in case you wanted to make a quick getaway here.
That always comes in handy.
There's some great. In fact, the entire magazine is black and white on the inside, and only the cover is color, as was the printing back then. When I talked to John Peel about Fantasy Empire, he said that was the biggest cost, was keeping the magazine black and white on the inside, because any color pages were just cost prohibitive. And the magazine itself has a cover price of $3.50. And of course, none of the authors or contributors to this magazine were paid. The money received from the magazine basically paid for publication. And that's pretty much how the fanzine world worked. Now, getting back to fanzines, I mentioned briefly that Jean Airy herself wrote a sequel to The Doctor and the Enterprise called The Doctor and the Lieutenant. And if you haven't figured out from our discussion, Jean Airy is Lieutenant Dorsey Stevens. She puts herself into that world. Now, in R&R 13 was the first time the Doctor and Lieutenant appeared, and it was reprinted one time only, and it's not available online. It was reprinted in a fanzine called The Blue Guardian, and it was in issue number 13. Issues of The Blue Guardian are available, number 13, impossible to find. So, of course, I have one.
I love it.
The Blue Guardian. And the Blue Guardian is an adult-oriented Star Trek / science fiction, Doctor Who fanzine.
Hence the name, I
in fact, on the front cover, it says, some material contains sexually explicit scenes and may be offensive to some people, not for sale to minors. And by the way, I know I'm going to describe this, but just to show it to our panelists here, it's basically a cardboard cover with 2 staples.
But not a brown paper wrapper. This might be appropriate, apparently.
Yeah, except it's blue.
Yeah.
And just looking at, when I got a hold of this many years ago, but it has page 39, the Lieutenant and the Doctor by Jean Airy. Of course, I'm going to keep the podcast PG, and I will not read aloud any scenes that might offend people. But basically, a story. The story basically is that Lieutenant Dorsey Stevens stows away aboard the TARDIS when the TARDIS leaves the Enterprise, and they begin a sexual adventure together.
Oh my!
I would not have predicted that from the novel that we read. I would not have seen it coming.
And it actually begins. The story begins with Dorsey in fact, in this story, she kind of goes into calling her Dorsey, and it's being told from Dorsey's perspective. And so it starts with her in the room, and she's getting messages from Spock and things like that. But then she sneaks aboard the TARDIS, and the artwork is actually very, very good. I'm just gonna this one I can actually show. It's not too bad, but this is the artwork.
I love it.
Oh
yeah,
my!
It's not bad at all, and and of course the drawing of the woman is actually Nurse Chapel from the series. So she's the original first officer on the pilot episode of Star Trek, too. If you're going into the Star Trek world. Mm-hmm. So that's the only place. After the Blue Guardian, the Lieutenant and the Doctor is only referred to in footnotes, and there is no text available online.
Wow.
I have not read the story in a long time, but I do remember that it gets pretty steamy
and you have not
places.
made the text available online either, it sounds like.
No, she did not.
No, but saying you have not. You have this.
No.
You have this treasure.
No, I haven't.
He's not a pimp, Alyson.
No. I'm just from the perspective of if copies of the Blue Guardian, copies of R&R, they're not terribly pricey. I mean, there are copies floating around for $30, $40. The original price was probably about $2 to $3. Which basically covered the and I'm trying to think it's very early. I'll just kind of show up the text here a little bit. You can kind of see it's early photocopy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, just it's like single space typewritten. So definitely not edited. and it was, it basically had I don't even know the name of the club that produced this. It just kind of became one that got circulated. There are so many of those. This was an underground fanzine, and this was a fanzine that was not part of that count that I gave earlier because no one had recorded it. So there are more out there than you could possibly get to. Anyway, getting back to the original story, Doctor and the Enterprise, it was put in the first 4 issues of Enterprise magazine. I don't have all 4. I just have the first. I have 1, 3, and 4, I believe. Just parts 1, parts 3, and part 4. They actually went to a photograph on the cover.
Oh, nice.
And that's why in the PDF that I sent out, and of course the first actual published edition was in 4 parts. They basically just took the material from Enterprise magazine and just put that together as it was, including the what happened so far, and as if you were reading it month to month versus in one place. So nobody bothered to edit it. Now the publication of the book is extremely contentious. When it was decided that it was reprinted basically without her permission or her knowledge until after it had happened, and it's the most reprinted fan story in history that we could find. So it's published by a standalone zine with her permission. The Zeta Minor one was with her permission. The 1986 version was done without her permission, and that was the book that I sent you. It has this cover. It's a really bad cover.
Yep.
But the price of the book was $9.95 or $13.95 in Canada.
Oh my God, that's
And
an
so-
exorbitant
People getting
price.
second jobs in Canada.
Yeah, absolutely.
For a
it's just,
pamphlet.
yeah, it's basically the same type of thing that the magazines of the time. It was a color cover with black and white pages on the side, but all the material was pulled directly from. If you were to hold this up to the Enterprise magazines, they're the exact same thing. And by the way, published by the same company, New Media Press. The publishers basically did this without her permission. So basically, if I could just say that there was a quote in 1990, and I'm going to read her quote. It says, "Anything that is being sold commercially is not with my approval, and I'm the flaming author of the thing. This is really ridiculous. I'm going to write the publisher, but I'm also going to ask Paramount and Lionheart to send a cease and desist as well." Oh, wow. Now, at the time, Paramount Pictures owns the rights to Star Trek, and Lionheart Entertainment owned Doctor Who at the time. That's during the 90s. The Doctor Who was off the air at this point, and so it kind of got pushed to a third party. And Lionheart was actually in charge of distributing it to the United States and things like that. But she also left out the Terry Nation estate. So, because they used the Daleks.
Yeah.
The story is fun, but it sure isn't worth $14.95. And how come they can get away with clear violations of the copyrights of 2 previously copyrighted universes without having their head chopped off? Especially with Paramount's well-known tetchiness for violations of their Trek universe. And she actually writes, "Erg." "Please let folks know that I have no part in this scam, and my offer to send a Xerox to anyone who sends me a large SASE marked first class with $1.45 postage on it. Don't pay the ripoff folks anything." And this is a direct quote of Jean Airy that was published in a fanzine called Terrell Cell. So all the commercially published books are illegal.
That's interesting. It sounds like you rarely hear about a fanzine author sicking the companies on someone else rather than on themselves.
Right.
Because it's their
Well,
own
it's-
work that she's
Exactly,
sicking them
and
So did she face any
I've
backlash for that?
no, she didn't, and neither did the publishers.
on. Oh.
Although there were several cease and desist orders, and that'll bring me to the reprint in 1986. They actually reprinted it, this time with this cover, with a red cover here, and the price is still $9.95. And they did it for a whole other year. Now, publication was halted in mid-1987. There's no explanation. In fact, that's about the time when Fantasy Empire started running down. I think New Media Press was out of business or getting close to being out of business. So that could be what was going on. But this whole thing here in what she was talking about was another publisher got a hold of the manuscript and decided to publish it, and that was Pioneer Books. And that's this little gem here, The Doctor and the Enterprise by Gene Airy with this horrible cover. This one does have a back cover blurb on it.
Yeah, that's the one.
Has an
that you can see
ISBN
on
number.
Amazon, right?
This is the one you can find on Amazon. And the original price, again, it's $9.95 or $13.95 Canada, so they didn't change the price. However, they heavily edited this book to try to avoid those cease and desist orders. And so what they did is they took all of the Star Trek proper names out of the book.
What?
So what I want to do is I'm going to read a little bit of text here so you can see what they did. They left the Doctor in there. "Wait a minute," the Doctor said. "I can see no error," said the scientist. "You're a Time Lord. You're not a Time Lord." So the captain said to the scientist, referring to the engineer and offering the communications officer.
Oh my god.
Oh god.
So did
It
they
gets better.
improve the plot inconsistencies at all, or just switch
No,
out
it's the
names?
same plot.
They, while they're in there with a screwdriver
Same
and a
plot.
wrench.
Not that much
But
editing.
but it gets better here when we know the Daleks are attacking. They are now called the Tin Woodsmen.
Oh my god.
Oh goodness.
Oh no. Oh.
Welcome to Light Under. Yeah, this is they do
didn't
use
have
the
to change
norms and the
Light
techies.
That was available.
Yeah, but they don't use any proper names. They refer to Jim Kirk as the captain, Spock is the scientist, Scotty is the engineer, the physician for Dr. McCoy, the xenobiologist for Dorsey Stevens.
And she's not even a copyrighted character.
No, but I don't think they wanted to tick off Gene Airy at this point.
Yeah.
Too late.
It was too late, and she didn't get anything from, and it's impossible to find out how many books sold because Pioneer Books doesn't exist anymore as a publisher. They're now a store. But a bunch of, you can find this. I think you won't pay more than $40 for a copy of this if you really want one in the secondary market. It's and what I'm basically saying in the collector's scheme of things, yeah, these are great, but they're not really worth much because it's still available for free. So to counteract these illegal versions, she published the entire story online in 1991. The original site she published to was through an AOL site, so a little blast from the past for some of you. America Online had a couple forums, and she published her story there. And then it moved to a free serve, and then several universities had it on their listservs. And I think we're serving up a little too much for those who don't know what I'm talking about.
No, I was just thinking about, she published on AOL in 1991. I didn't realize that AOL was around in 1991. I thought it was like 93 or 4. Okay.
I think it was around in 91.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The dial-up. Remember you used to get those discs in the mail?
Yeah.
Constantly.
Yeah, I'm just remembering 91. I was 6 years old. The idea of the internet to me hadn't even occurred.
Oh, you sweet
Like,
summer child.
Well, I mean, I don't think even in school we had access to the internet until I was in middle school in 7th or 8th grade.
That's probably about right.
Yeah.
Because the internet at this time was extremely limited, and I think, unless you had a CompuServe account or an AOL account or a Prodigy account, you weren't online.
Yeah. So I think it's really fascinating, that this was available to people that knew where to find it.
Absolutely, and you can still find it today. It's been basically restored into different places, and it was meant to be a free story. Mm-hmm. She never wanted this thing to be commercially available because of all the hoops she would have to jump through to get any kind of rights, and then after it was over, she wouldn't get any royalties for it.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you'd be paying Paramount Pictures, you'd be paying Lionheart, and the Terry Nation estate. Anytime you mention the word Dalek in something, Terry Nation gets money, even though he's been dead for how many years?
You can take it with you.
Absolutely. You sure can. And the story made the rounds in the 80s as basically a passed-around photocopied typewritten format with old-style binding clips. I do remember that's what I had, except he punched 3 holes in it for the binder. I read it and I returned it back to the gentleman. Jim Tierney was his name, and I gave it back to him. Those versions are actually worth a little more than the published versions. If you still have a copy that Gene Airy sent you, you could get a few bucks for it because there aren't very many floating around anymore. Because the idea was you read it and then you passed it along to somebody else, which is how the story got popular and why it was being talked about in so many different places. Copies of the first 4 issues of Enterprise magazine have the complete story. Those are starting to get harder to find. Of course, the sequel we talked about, The Doctor and Lieutenant, only published in 2 places, the R&R 13 and the Blue Guardian number 13. And, you know, that's the only place you can get that. That basically is that's why the publication history is so murky, because it was intended as a fan fiction in a fanzine. And there were, like I said, so many fanzines. My favorite Doctor Who fanzine title, by the way, is No, Not the Mind Probe. That's a real one.
Yep.
The big one that's still out is one called Whotopia,
Yes.
which you can actually download for free. You can do they're very good, though. The artwork is pretty incredible, and it's an amazing thing. You can pay, it's $9.99 Canadian. It's a Canadian group. Or you can download it for free online. And fanzines, of course, throughout Doctor Who history. I remember going back to the 80s with the Celestial Toy Room from the Doctor Who Appreciation Society.
Yes.
And these were mailed out. You basically got a bulk rate passage. This is from California. And then, of course, Tony, you might remember the Doctor Who Bulletin.
Oh, yeah. Have a few of those, in fact.
Now the copy I'm holding is the one from September 85, when it said in the 60s the average length of a Doctor Who season was 42 episodes, but in 86 it was 14. And a few years ago at Chicago TARDIS, we did a panel on Trial of a Time Lord, and I had this out on the table, and somebody next to me picked it up and said, "This is the original." I said, "Of course."
Do you know who I am?
I am that old.
This should get to be your
Do you
name
know who I
tag.
am? Right,
Not
yeah,
Larry,
it's-
but do you know who I am?
Yeah, but
Do you know what I have in this basement? I have erotica you have
Absolutely.
only dreamed of.
This is true. You know, it's funny when I do, and of course, you know, my listeners know this well following the story. When I've done the conventions talking about collecting Doctor Who, and I bring a small sampling, which is usually 9 boxes of things. And of course, when I did the virtual, and if you haven't seen the virtual collecting panel, it's out there on YouTube. You can just search for that under Chicago TARDIS, and I had everything like set out on tables, and I was going, and I remember at the end, Nick Seidler and came out and said, "Wow." I have never, some of those things I've never even seen before. I'm like, well, that does happen. I had the Doctor Who Give a Show projector out on a table for the live podcast. Tony, you might remember that.
Yes, I do.
And the 2 British comic book writers came in afterwards and said, "I've never seen one of those up close." Well, that's why we do this. We want to try to get there, and
To
of course,
attract
you know,
venerators.
absolutely, and
To touch the relics.
some of our listeners are collecting Star Trek, and also, you know, Battlestar Galactica was big, and you know, we also carried The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and other, you know, spy books and things like that. There was James Bond was real big, you know, when I was working back with bundles, we basically had all of this stuff and took it to various conventions, and you know, we basically pandered to the audience. You know, if it was a Star Trek convention, we had a lot of Star Trek stuff. If it was a Who convention, we had Doctor Who things. If we were doing a mixed convention, we brought a mixture of things. Mm-hmm. And that's basically the knowledge that we built up over the years, kind of doing that. And of course, you know, I'll kind of just share for our panelists here the story. Of course, Bundles from Britain, I started in 1984. My second customer was Gene Smith, and he became my partner. Mm-hmm. And I ended up in 1989. I decided to go to college and get a degree and, you know, grow up.
And he kept going with it. And a few years later, he started Chicago TARDIS, based on our experiences in 1985 and 86 doing conventions. Mm-hmm. So
nice.
So I have a pretty good place on the ground floor.
Yeah.
Sitting in my room one night going, hey, I'm going to do this. And everybody said, you're crazy.
Which is why people like us have to say thank you for your service.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I still relish the catalog that was hand-drawn. And you can find PDFs of this online too, the Bundles from Britain catalog. And of course the fanzine we did with the Many Companions was done by the same artist. So the artwork was part of it. It was really good artwork. And some of the articles we had were written by Rhonda Del Balchio, who's an award-winning author.
Yeah.
Tony, I think you've heard of her?
I have indeed, yes. I have.
Okay. Yeah, she was a member of our little group, along with Gene Smith and Bob Wettendorf. And, we were just all a group of Doctor Who fans who got together and had a great time back in 1984, 85. And that's how all this started. So so basically the Doctor and the Enterprise, just in wrapping up that part here, is, it's a great story for those that want to read it, but I would recommend if you can seek out the original edition, that would be better, and try not to, fortunately the versions that were published are no longer in print, so they're no longer a thing, but she vehemently fought against those publications for a long time, and not just that interview that she did in 91. She did talk more about that, as far as I know from people that knew her. She got very disgusted whenever she saw it in a bookstore, or saw it at a comic book store, or saw it at a convention. It really bothered her that somebody went and did that. And of course, today, no one would think of doing that because the lawyers would be on you pretty fast.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sad, really, isn't it? People spend all their time making nice things, and other people come along and break them.
So that takes us to the next part of our podcast here, which is collection protection. Of course, everybody wants to protect your fanzines, and of course, Blue Guardian number 13 is 8.5 by 11. Most fanzines are 8.5 by 11 or folded in half, because that was the paper you had. And if you wanted to do odd sizes, then the printer charged you a lot more money to do cutting and all that great stuff. So you can actually go to bagsunlimited.com, and you're looking for a regular magazine sleeve, which is 8 5/8 by 11 1/8, with a 2 mil polyethylene material with a 1.5 inch flap, and that will cover your fanzines for the most part. They do fit. However, the Doctor Who Bulletin is slightly longer, so you will have a little bit, the flap won't go quite as far, and I'll illustrate this on our website. Our website, by the way, is drwhocollectors.com. Bags Unlimited, if you call them, 1-800-767-2247, and tell them you heard this on the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast. You won't get anything, but at least it'll get the name out.
Yes, exactly.
Money to be paid from your private purse. No! You spake.
And of course, I always conclude with the most outrageous offer. Those of you out there, I get these emailed to me on a regular basis, and somebody had found a Doctor Who item that was priced a little too high or a little too ridiculous. So we did a little research here, and as everybody might be familiar with the Doctor Who Annual 2019, that was the one with Jodie Whittaker on the front,
yes,
and Panini Books. And so we have a bookseller here called Mad for Books, out of Wolsingham in the United Kingdom. They've been a seller online since 2010 with a 5-star rating. They are currently offering this book in good condition. By the way, shipping is $62.84 from the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
But the price they're asking for is $1,438.27.
What? Oh my God.
Is it attached to via net to a flock of sparrows who fly it over?
I think it should be
Greenland?
probably in a solid gold handbag.
Yes.
We did look into this price, and it turns out that many of the items from Mad for Books are priced pretty high. So we reached out to them. We have not heard back to ask, is this the real price, or did you guys make a mistake with the decimal point? A lot of times when we, and just, our listeners are used to this, but for the Target Book Club audience, when I find an outrageous offer and I put it out there, people are looking for it right away. I post the link on our website. Usually the link disappears within 48 hours of publication. We had a calendar for $1 million in one episode. But rest assured, though, you are not out of luck with the 2019 annual, because you can still get it new on Amazon for $9.99 plus shipping, or if you're a Prime member, you get it for free shipping.
Yeah.
So
they really are mad for books.
So mad for books. So this is the
sell
copy I
just
received from
one. That would do it for
Amazon.com, and it still says it's $10.99 on here price, but they have it for $9.99 on Amazon. So if you find an outrageous offer or a price that looks a little too high, copy the link and send it to us at drwhocollectorspodcast@gmail.com, and your outrageous offer might just reach the podcast. So in kind of wrapping up the whole idea here. So this was a wonderful opportunity to celebrate one of the podcasts that I promote regularly on my podcast, the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast. I am a regular listener. I am caught up with the Sunmakers. And that was a great story. My favorite parts, and I'll be honest, you guys don't get to hear this usually from a listener, but Dalton adds a lot to this podcast. I love his insights, and some of the notes that he comes up with really draw you in. So that's really great stuff. I love Alyson's one-liners. They're absolutely.
Now, why would you assume that no one ever says that I'm funny?
You don't hear it from us, that's for sure.
That is for sure, yes.
I've listened to enough, and of course, you'll also enjoy Jenny Ingersoll on the program. And when she's on there, she has some funny ones as well. And of course, you're an incomparable host, Tony Whitt. He is our Target book expert. Whenever our podcast talks about Target books of any kind, the law is we include him on the discussions, and he's been on all the discussions with us for that. So we, of course, are very grateful to Tony and your knowledge of Target books.
And thank you. I love being on the program whenever I can. And
thank you.
If it weren't for listeners like you, we would not have made 100 episodes. So definitely.
Absolutely. And if you're not listening to the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, and for some of you in my audience, this is your first time, you can find them almost anywhere you find your podcasts. If you're on Apple or Google or Stitcher Radio and the various places, you can find them as well. Just go into the Google search engine, type in the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, and a number of links come up, and you can follow them there. We also we support each other, and this is one of the reasons why when I came up with this thought, and Tony was like, "Hey, this sounds great. Let's do a joint podcast, get our audiences involved in different things," because I always think, hey, they're reading the Target books in story order. Guess what? They weren't published that way. And I'm kind of an unusual collector because I put my books in publication order, because there is actually a method to that, because the logos are the same, the artwork is the same, the binding is the same, the back cover art ends at a certain point in 76. So there's something to that. Also, when you read them in story order, you get a book that was published in 75 and the next one in 81.
Oh, yeah.
So, and you've talked about that, I know very well, and the stories and how they differ from the television series. And I've been honored to be a guest to a couple episodes here, including this one. I was on Day of the Daleks and Mind of Evil, and that was a enjoyable time. I've attended a couple of the live tapings at Chicago TARDIS, and you definitely need to check this out. This is just, I'm talking as a fan. Nobody has paid me for this placement.
Nobody could.
And nobody can. But definitely support your local Doctor Who podcast. And I always, I'm kind of leaving out, I typically do bumpers in the middle of mine, but for this particular episode, I'm going to leave them out. But one more you do need to check out is the Police Box in a Junkyard podcast with Eric O'Branson. It's a great, they basically do a random Doctor Who story, whether it be a book, comic book, audio, TV adventure, movie, or whatever happens to come up on his random select, that's Big Finish. The random thing he does, the Random White Selectatron, that's the Big Finish podcast. So you gotta keep your podcast straight. But I hope you learned something, and if you have any questions regarding fanzines, or where to find fanzines and things like that, my biggest thing there is to, give us a shout at Doctor Who Collectors Podcast at gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn at Doctor Who Collectors Podcast. And Tony, tell us again where we can find the Target Book Club podcast.
You can find it anywhere you find podcasts, including Spotify, and you can email us at emperadolic@gmail.com and find us on Facebook at Doctor Who Target Book Club Podcast, all in words with no spaces, like a crazy person.
Well, special thanks to Tony Whitt, Dalton Hughes, and Alyson Fitch-Safreed. And I'm Larry VanMersbergen for the Doctor Who Collectors Podcast. And we thank you for listening, and please support both of our podcasts and enjoy your travels.